right, everyone! USA!
I'm gonna get some safety goggles next time.
No matter what you think about the United States, you can't deny it's one of the most fascinating countries on the planet. It's like the overachiever in class. Only 4% of the world's population, yet somehow producing 25% of all goods and services globally. That's as much as China, India, and Russia combined. And they've got billions of people. But how did the US become such a powerhouse? Let's dive into history and find out. The US story didn't start with Columbus. Spoiler, he didn't discover anything. Long before him, about 20,000 years ago during the Ice Age, people from Siberia thought that it's time to find a warmer place to live. And they decide to go to, Alaska. And you might think, that's a hell of a swimming. Well, not exactly. There was a land bridge connecting them two. So they crossed over, settled in North America, and became the ancestors of Native Americans. These so-called Paleo-Indians formed tribes, fought wars, and built civilizations. Some of them pretty advanced. You can just look at the architecture of the Maya. Their temples alone could make European medieval architects jealous. And they probably did. Because in 1492, Columbus decided to visit them. But he didn't discover America. Let's say he opened the door for widespread European exploration and eventual colonization of the Americas. Because after that, Spain started claiming areas like Florida or California, becoming first European country to do it before it went mainstream. While the Spanish were busy trying to convert Native Americans to Christianity, whether they wanted to or not, England was catching up. By 1607, they set up Jamestown, Virginia, where they quickly found out that tobacco was the real green gold. Who knew that smoking could pay the bills? Anyways, by the 1700s, the British colonies were thriving, trading with Asia, building ships, and stacking up some serious coin. Not this one. Suddenly, taxes were popping up like unwanted pop-up ads. Then, restrictions were raining down and things got kind of sticky. After the 7 Years' War, Britain decided it was time to drain the colonies' pockets to cover their war bills. But the colonists were like, no way, Jose. And that's how the idea for the American Revolution began to sprout. And so, in 1776, 13 colonies declared independence. Sure, they were small, scrappy, and divided, but they had one thing in common. They were tired of Britain's nonsense. After 8 years of war, the U.S. officially became a nation in 1783, with George Washington as its first president. By the 19th century, the U.S. was obsessed with manifest destiny, the idea that it was their destiny to control land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Sounds noble. Well, in reality, that means taking land from Native Americans, Mexico, and anyone else in the way. And so the Mexican-American War started, where the U.S. took half of Mexico's territory. Well, and Texas got a massive mere $15 million for this. The only thing cheaper was probably Alaska, and that came with polar bears. The Civil War was a turning point for the U.S. The North, fueled by industry and immigration, clashed with the agricultural South, which relied on slavery. The North won, slavery was ended, and the country was experiencing an industrial boom. Factories, railroads, automobiles, and steamships were being built. But most of this development was concentrated on the East Coast. What is the most popular state in the U.S. today? Correct? California, home to Silicon Valley in San Francisco and the Hollywood Dream Factory in Los Angeles. But back in the early 20th century, these western lands were barely populated compared to the crowded East Coast. Now, looking at how populated California is today, you might think that the U.S. understood the importance of developing its West, and they made it happen. But there was a problem. To transport goods from New York to San Francisco by sea, you had to sail 20,500 kilometers around the entire continent of South America. That distance was so long you could have made 2 round trips to England in the same time, assuming you didn't hit an iceberg. For the rest of the world, trading with Europe from countries like China and Japan was much closer than trading with the US. Something had to change. This brings us to an important story of how the United States defends its national interests. At the time, they launched a war with the declining Spanish Empire and came out of it with Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and even overthrew the government in Hawaii, taking islands in eastern Samoa too. Now they've got loads of new territories spread it over tens of thousands of kilometers across two oceans. To connect these two oceans, they needed a canal. There was a potential location in Nicaragua, but it was rejected as too expensive and risky because of volcanic activity that could ruin the project. That left the narrow strip of Panama, which was owned by Colombia at the time. Americans needed that canal desperately to develop their western coast, protect their new Pacific territories, control trade routes, and most importantly, quickly move their navy between oceans. Here's what happened next. On November 3rd, 1903, Panama revolted for independence. What U.S. did? They saw this as an opportunity and their navy blocked Colombia's military from stopping the uprising. Just 2 days later, on November 6, the U.S. officially recognized Panama as an independent state, and within 12 days a treaty was signed giving the U.S. the right to permanently station its armed forces in Panama, build the canal, and maintain control over it. For this unique historical opportunity, the U.S. paid $10 million upfront and $250,000 annually in rent. During the 20th century, there were several uprisings in Panama, and the U.S. stepped in to stop them. But on December 31st, 1999, the U.S. finally handed control of the canal back to Panama. But what did this canal change in global trade? Well, previously, it was faster to trade with Europe from ports in East Asia like Shanghai or Yokohama. But with the canal, new trade routes emerged that made it much quicker to trade through New York. And most importantly, the U.S. gained the ability to rapidly move its navy between oceans, concentrating its forces wherever they wanted to influence events. Even now in the 21st century, sea routes like the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, and the Bosporus Strait are incredibly important. And we can see how countries compete to control these key waterways because they handle most of the world's trade, and with trade comes money. So thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, who was the main driving force behind the Panama Canal project on the American side, and by the way, around that time, Roosevelt openly declared a principle that, in many ways, the U.S. still follows today.
If anywhere in the world,
especially in Latin America at that time,
whenever conflict happens, the U.S. felt free to use its military power to resolve them.
But where did such opportunities and appetites come from? Well, it's because at the time there were no competitors around. Only maybe Mexico, but they had enough from the war we mentioned before. Now pay attention to the timeline. By 1850, the U.S. dominated North America. By 1900, just 50 years later, they controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, thanks in part to the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, which stated, "We'll intervene wherever we want." Anyways, another 50 years later, right after World War II, the U.S. Navy was operating globally. Now, two key points. During World War II, U.S. industrial production doubled, and a significant role was played by the Lend-Lease Act. Initially, this policy allowed the U.S. to supply food, weapons, and equipment to the Soviet Union to fight against Germany, and get paid for this later. But here's the part often overlooked. The Lend-Lease Act first focused on supporting Great Britain. The deal included a crucial clause called reverse Lend-Lease, where Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Free France handed over most of their naval bases in the Western Hemisphere to the U.S. This gave America control of the North Atlantic. And so, by the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. had no serious rivals and could act freely. But let's put it this way. If the U.S. only relied on showing off its military strength, it wouldn't have achieved much. You can't force people to like you. Instead, the U.S. offered the world something more appealing: advanced technology and a massive consumer market. So what they did, after World War II, American consumers gradually started buying cheaper goods, first from Japan, then Germany, South Korea, and eventually China. And each of these countries experienced what's often called an economic miracle. And every time, the U.S. played a key role in helping it happen. For Japan, they provided technology. For Germany, they offered money and protection. For South Korea, they gave smaller but steady support. And for China, they invested heavily. And now, who is the biggest buyer of Chinese goods today? The U.S. Who is the biggest buyer of German goods? The U.S. Who is the biggest buyer of South Korean and Japanese products? Wrong, China, but U.S. is second. But it's not just about military and financial power. Another key factor in America's global leadership is its control over advanced technology. They don't always need to invent everything, but they often control the innovation. Look, each year the world registers between 350,000 to 1 million new patents. And how many of those are American? About half. And this is the key to the future. In the past, a country like the United States could build its economic power using the labor of immigrants. In the early 20th century, labor was cheap, so poor people flocked to where they could earn more and have a chance to improve their lives. But today, things work differently. What's needed now are people who can develop new technologies, increase productivity, and which is most importantly, solve the problem of labor shortages in the future. Even though the world's population reached 8 billion in 2022, birth rates in developed countries are still falling. In the future, whether in the US, Japan, or Russia, half the population will be retirees while the other half will have to support them. You can no longer just pull people from villages, throw them on construction sites or into factories and expect economic growth. In the future, factories won't look like this, but like that. Now, what's needed are people who can design and maintain robots. For the US, this is a very favorable situation. They have the financial resources to either attract the brightest minds from around the world or train them themselves, because the US remains the most popular and attractive country for international students today. And what's also important is that Americans have been perfecting the process of extracting commercial value from inventions for a century. The scheme is almost always the same. There are teams of scientists in universities or individual inventors. They develop new projects or ideas, and scientists always know that funding for research will be found. Inventors understand that if they come up with something truly useful, then no one will take it away from them or waste it, and they will be able to sell their patent and make money. Let's take real examples from different eras. Nikola Tesla, born in Croatia and moved to US because he saw it as the land of opportunity for inventors like himself. In Europe, he faced limited resources and support for his ambitious ideas. But in America, he found an environment where innovation was valued and funded. Tesla's breakthroughs in alternating current technology became the backbone of modern electricity systems, not because he was just brilliant, but because America gave him the tools and support to make his vision a reality. Fast forward to today, and we see someone like Elon Musk, a name that directly pays homage to Tesla. Musk's companies, Tesla and SpaceX, have revolutionized electric vehicles and space exploration, but how America helped them to evolve. 2008, SpaceX faced significant financial and technical challenges and nearly going bankrupt after several failed rocket launches. Why nearly? Because NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract in 2008 under its CRS program. And even now you can see how much support Musk gets, perhaps too much lately. And now let's look at today's climate. Trump has been re-elected as president. But do you remember when Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook suspended Trump's accounts following the Capitol riot in 2021? Or Bill Gates donating $50 million to Kamala Harris's campaign? You might think, oh, there's a money war coming between them. But no, they're best friends now because they all realize that they live under the same roof. But here's the real takeaway. The so-called magic of America isn't magic at all. It's the result of people striving to be free, paired with solid early laws and, most importantly, good old-fashioned pragmatism. While Europe's colonial powers were busy arguing over which king was better, the US focused on something far more modern and practical, building an economy based on markets, not monarchs. This allowed their industry to outpace the competition, and their success lies not in mysticism, but in a history that simply made sense. And if you, my viewer, want this story to keep going, hit that subscribe button, because history is only worth telling if there's someone to hear it. See you next time, my friends.